So for our next speaker, we have another very lovely guest from Salesforce. Just get him up here. We have a talk called Journey from Design Afterthought to Design First. We have Dan Winterberg, the design director at Salesforce, and he joins us all the way from San Francisco. He's been leading design for Salesforce's SaaS suite on little screens. Salesforce's SaaS suite. His work has ranged from designing complex systems at scale for Fortune 100 companies to helping startups define delightful user-centered products. Let's put our hands together and give Dan a warm welcome.
Well, thank you. I've been told to watch out for the cord, which I will do. Thanks for having me, everyone. Thanks. This is my first time to Toronto. It's a wonderful city for any of you who live here. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some challenges that I've had over the course of my career. I'm assuming that some people in this room have also had some similar challenges where I've inherited a team or joined a team where design was a little bit of an afterthought for the company. It wasn't taken as seriously. We got a lot of, just make it look good kind of comments initially. And trying to take that team from that very tactical place to a much more strategic role at the company overall. So just a little bit of background about me. I started my design career at Apple. I was actually in marketing previously to being in product design. And while I was there, made the transition into UX. And the talk this morning really hit home with me because while I was at Apple, I was definitely doing a lot of poor design without realizing how bad it was. But I got a lot of support in learning how to do it a little bit better while I was there. And then moved from the in-house team side to working at Cooper, where I did design consulting for 5 years there before going to Fitbit, which is obviously a very B2C focused company and solving a lot of problems on how to deliver great designs on a very small screen size. So I was managing the team that designed the on-wrist interface and moved from there to Salesforce, where I am today, which is the exact opposite of the Fitbit experience. It's enterprise software, very complex systems that we deal with there. So I want to, in particular, talk about those last two experiences, because at Fitbit, kind of the way. I mean, there's no real, actual way that the teams were prioritized. But if you thought about it, a lot of the Fitbit business model and the way that things got done was based on the limitations of the hardware. You had to make sure the battery life was high, and so hardware engineering had an oversized impact on kind of how things got done. If I were to rank after that, it was a very product management driven culture. And then we also had software engineering, which, again, dealing with a lot of the limitations of the hardware itself, had an outsized influence. And then it was probably design about like fourth, if I was going to be honest. At Salesforce, similar-ish. Sales is obviously first. It's in the name. It's probably no surprise. And again, you have a culture that has historically been driven on the software and the product management side, and design is kind of, fourth, if I'm for a lot of groups at Salesforce. It's a big enough company that, thinking about Jared's talk this morning, there's definitely a lot of teams that are a little bit further along. But overall, design, when I joined the company, was still kind of finding its way. So the big question is, at Apple, if somebody said, there's a design problem that we have, we need to stop the presses, we can't ship this thing, that got taken very seriously. But what if you don't work at a company like Apple or Airbnb, where that can happen? How do you do that? How do you make that journey? And a lot of it, honestly, comes down to our job as design leaders. In a lot of ways, is to do education and educate the folks that are at the company who are not designers of the value that we can bring. So a little bit of the way that I've thought about it in my career from a framework standpoint is kind of a 3-step process. So starting out by just shoring up the design team, looking inwards and making sure your design team has the the ability to actually deliver when you eventually ask them to take on these more strategic projects. So really focusing on the design team first. Then once that's in a good place, starting to look outwards to the larger product teams. So really building those relationships with the product managers and the engineering teams within those teams. And then finally, once that groundwork has been laid, really starting to look beyond just the product space and onto the leadership team and how design can have an influence when it comes to a lot of the strategy for the company. So another way to think about this is, that those first stages, you're not even at the table, you're not even in the building, so it's just like getting in the building, and then looking out to really try and get in the room, and then once you're in the room, actually getting a seat at the table. So something that got mentioned a couple times this morning, I will reiterate, it is a long journey. It took Disney 17 years. It doesn't have to take you that long, but it definitely is something that is not a quick process. You're not going to have one conversation with one executive and all of a sudden, the switch is going to flip. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how I've approached each of those stages. So starting with looking in and really becoming a great design team. At this point, I'm going to describe something that I think is probably going to be familiar to a lot of folks, is what it looks like at this point is a restaurant, really. You have a ticket comes in from product or engineering, you cook it as fast as you can, and you move on to the next ticket. And that's kind of the operating model that a lot of the teams that I inherited wound up operating in, is just like move as quickly as possible. Don't worry too much about quality because we just have to ship. And you probably hear a lot of this: make it pop, make it look good. Not super inspiring for the design teams overall. But in a lot of situations, your design team is going to be a little bit more on the junior side when they're doing this kind of work. And so a lot of it is really just trying to get a cohesive design team. That's what you're trying to accomplish in this phase. So that transactional work, that's generally going to be a little bit less motivating for your team over the long term. So you're really trying to not just like build the skills, but you're also trying to keep momentum up and make sure your team is in a happy place. So you really want to try to move beyond that, making it look good. Ideally, exiting this phase, you want one of your more senior folks to kind of be in a place where they can kind of do the execution on their own, to allow you for some time and space to work on the things that you need to do as a leader. So as a leader, what should you be doing in this phase? Well, kind of three major buckets that you should be paying attention to. The first is something that honestly doesn't matter what stage you're in. You should really be very intentional about, and that is hiring like your job depends on it, because it does. It is a big deal who you hire. I have made plenty of hiring mistakes in my career and have wound up paying for it for the next 6 to 12 months. And so when you're hiring, really be intentional about the folks that you're bringing on board. And at Salesforce in particular, one of the things that we found is not even necessarily hiring for skill sets at this early phase, really hiring for whether or not they have curiosity and whether or not they have grit. Like those are the kinds of things that you're going to be trying to be hiring for, not necessarily skills, because we can teach skills. There's a lot of different tools out there, and so a tool that they use at one company, we may not be using, so we'd rather hire for somebody who has that curiosity and can learn those tools, but also learn the design process as well. Secondly, there's a great talk about this morning. At this point, establishing process really matters a lot, and for us, at Salesforce, two things kind of stick out. One is really getting a handle on quantitatively how much work is being done, what work is being done, and getting a sense of that throughput. Because what that's going to allow you to do in the following phases is start to say no to projects that are less impactful. But in order to do that, you kind of need to know just what's going on and who's working on what. And that also helps you prevent a lot of the burnout that we often see with folks in this kind of stage. Second part of process that's really important is to really encourage a crit culture that is open and honest, because that's how you as a design leader are going to be able to scale the quality of the team. So establishing process that both tracks the quantity of work being done and also the quality. And the third thing is to really celebrate the wins. Again, that tactical work is not necessarily going to be the sexiest. So finding projects where you can celebrate those wins goes a long way to helping the team feel good about the work that they're doing and really acknowledging where they are being impactful at that point. So while you're doing that, the team, speaking of wins, should really be thinking about how do you put the team in a position where they can get those quick wins. Especially if you're going into an established team, this is something that's really important. They don't know you, you don't know them, and so how do you get them into a project where they can feel like they're having success? You can prove to them, hey, I can help unblock you, I can help you move things forward. Whereas previously that had been, if that had been a problem for them, that's definitely helps build trust. One of the best examples of this that we had at Fitbit was I took over the team that was managing the on-wrist devices, and every single one of the Fitbit devices at the time had a very different interface. The notifications came from a different place, a lot of the visual design was all over the place, and the first thing we did was get the entire team in a room for a one-day offsite to just brainstorm, how do we get a unified navigational experience on every single device that we produce from here on out. So it wasn't necessarily reflecting on the past, it was thinking about how do we impact that moving forward. And that work wound up informing the kind of 2-year roadmap from there on out. And it really it brought the team together, made them feel like, hey, we're starting to get some influence here and we're starting to work in a way that's a lot more inspiring. The second thing at this stage is really focusing on skills. I mentioned earlier those hard skills, but you also want to start thinking about those soft skills at this point too. Making sure that folks can present to executives, to larger audiences, and are able to kind of sell their design in addition to doing the hard design work. That becomes really important. In future stages, you'll need to build those PM and engineering relationships, so that starts to, again, be really critical for getting stuff done. The third thing that the team should really be doing at this point is everything together always, as much as possible. There's both at Fitbit and Salesforce, we're not even that big of a team at Fitbit. It was when I started 30 designers and it grew to 50, which is decent size. But there was already this tension of, do we embed with the product teams, or do we sit together as a design team? And there's always going to be that tension, but at this early phase, what you really need to be doing is building a design culture. And because of that, I would always bias towards having those teams sit together as a design team first, and then reevaluating as you get further along and the team is more used to working together. You can start splitting them up and having them embed a little bit more, but at this phase, just as much face time as they can have with each other, the better. So that's that first phase. So once you kind of got that figured out, more or less, you'll start wanting to look out beyond the design team. So you'll probably, even in that first phase, start to see some good integration with the PM and engineering cadences and processes. And you'll also start to see some recognition from those teams that, hey, there's going to be some larger projects here that we're going to have to do some research on or think more deeply about, and so we can't necessarily rely on doing that design work in the same sprint that the engineering work is going to be done. But that's going to be kind of here and there. So big thing you're trying to do in this phase is really thinking about how do you build a cohesive product team. So getting the product team to work together is a three-legged stool where PM and engineering and design all come together to support this great product. Especially if you have some folks who are on the junior side, this is something where teaching those soft skills is going to be as important as the hard skills. So as a leader in this phase, again, three things to be doing. You as a leader and also some of the senior folks on your team should start learning how the business works. because I found that a lot of the ways that we get design kind of sold through the company is by pulling those levers and speaking the language of business, because that's the language that the product team knows, that's the language that the exec team knows. They don't necessarily know the design language. So it's up to you to learn how to speak their language. So learn the business. You should know how the company makes money. You should know how the company determines if a product is successful or not. Those types of things start to become really important in this phase. It really allows you to advocate for your teams better. Second thing is prioritizing ruthlessly. I mentioned in that last phase that it was really critical to start getting processes in place to be able to track what's going on your team. If you don't know what's going on the team at that level, it's going to be really hard for you to start saying no to things, because there will be no sense of what the team's even working on, so you won't know what's the most important thing, and you'll get in this cycle of saying yes to a lot of things and doing a lot of things really poorly and not enough of the high impact things. So at this point as a leader, it's also important for you to start learning how to say no very gracefully to your partners. And that's a skill that is not easy to learn. I'm still definitely learning how to do it better. The third thing, and this is kind of the most critical at this phase, honestly, is learning to be a model facilitator. So what I mean by that is oftentimes, in this phase, I've found myself inviting myself to strategic meetings without kind of asking for permission, just doing it. The other way I've kind of found my way into that room is by volunteering to facilitate conversations with executives or PM or engineering, and just saying, like, I'm just going to be in the room to help capture things and facilitate the conversation. But what that allows you to do is then insert design thinking into that room. One example of this at Salesforce, kind of the way we do our annual planning is this tool called the V2 MOM, and that stands for vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures. And the way it works is at the beginning of every year, the executives for that group get together and they come up with a vision for, like, where do we want to be at the end of this year? What are our values? And those values usually don't change too much over time, but you want to articulate them. And then they go through a prioritized, force-ranked list of, here are the methods that we are going to use to get there. And historically, that had been a process where the executives would go off, they'd lock themselves in a room, and then they would come out and just deliver that message to the entire team, including the design team. What we volunteered to do as the design team was, we said to the PM and engineering executives, hey, we'll facilitate a workshop for you. And this is my VP of engineering partner and two of the product folks on our team. And this is the workshop that we did. You can notice a lot of stickies, so you can see that it's a very design-driven exercise. But we volunteered to run this workshop for helping them figure out, like, okay, what's important to us this year? How should we prioritize things? And they got a lot out of it, but what we got out of it was we were able to guide the conversation in a direction that allowed us to kind of insert things that were priorities for our users and for design into the conversation, and we wound up getting things prioritized that in previous years definitely would not have gotten much attention at all. So don't be afraid at this stage to kind of Trojan horse yourself into that conversation. Design thinking is super powerful. Definitely take advantage of it. As for your team at this stage, again, building on those relationships that you had in the previous stage is, again, very important in this stage as well. You want to be having those same lunches and coffees and beers with your PM and engineering partners that you had in the previous phase with your design partners. And being able to have those, that allows you to have those candid conversations with them when times are a little bit harder. The second thing is learning to slice up your big projects into smaller pieces. Oftentimes those engineering teams are going to be working on a sprint cadence or a release cadence. And as a design team, if you have those larger projects, again, you need to learn to speak in the language that the engineering team is working in a lot of ways. And so learning how to slice those bigger projects up into smaller pieces is going to be super helpful for your entire team. And the third thing is kind of related to kind of Trojan horsing yourself into those conversations. you don't ask for permission. Your folks should be learning that. And that is a big, big culture shift in a lot of ways in a lot of organizations. So the best thing to do there is model it for your people. You want to be also not asking for permission to be in those conversations and encouraging them to do the same. That example I gave earlier about going in and helping the VPs determine what the strategy was going to be for a year, our most senior designer was also involved in that conversation, and then he took that back to his team and ran a similar exercise with them. So he was able to kind of also Trojan horse his way into those conversations. But again, this is, like I said, it's a big, big culture shift, and you need to be able to give your people the permission to do that and let them know, hey, if you are going to have those conversations, I've got your back. And the best way to do that is, again, by modeling it. So once you've kind of got to that phase, then you can start kind of looking beyond just the product team to the company overall. And this is where you really get a lot of impact from it. So talked before about having this cohesive product teams. Really at this point, you want to have a cohesive leadership team. That's kind of the goal you're going for. And that means having alignment on those vision and priorities that you're working towards. And then, because you've built up these product teams that are very highly functional, those product teams can be a little more self-sufficient, and they can align on what that vision means for each of them individually. And that just empowers them and allows them to do things that, as a leadership team, you probably never would have thought of. So in this phase, again, I keep hating to keep harp on this, but relationships are super important. So you want to have those good relationships with your executive team, with the senior leadership at the company, to be able to honestly advocate for those nascent ideas that your team is going to come up with. Those are going to be really delicate at that early phase, and so you're going to want to be able to make space for your team to kind of figure things out and make sure that, like, hey, failure in the service of learning is going to be okay here. And you'll be able to have those transparent conversations with them. The second thing is, if you haven't gotten there already, data and research and design kind of working together becomes super critical. So data should be, you should have data intelligence of some kind, finding out what users are doing. You should have research telling you why they're doing it, and then you should have all three teams figuring out what is the solution, how do we solve for this, how do we deliver that best experience for the users. And executives should have visibility into that data and those conversations as well. And the third thing is, at this point, you shouldn't be learning the business. You should really know the business cold. It is your responsibility as a design leader to really know how a lot of those decisions are made, and know, if I make trade-offs on the design team, how does that impact the business overall? One of the interesting things is an interesting model that this gentleman, Tal Herman, came up with, which was having a shared definition of shippable across not just your product team, but across the company. And really here, you're constantly going to be pulled in that rightward direction towards perfection as a designer. That's what we all want, is like the absolute perfect product that is great out of the gate. And your design team is going to pull you in that direction. And then, I hope there's not too many engineers in the room, but you're going to get some engineers who are like, I just need to ship it. I want to make it this. If you did it a different way, it would be so much easier. And so they're going to kind of pull you in the leftward direction. I'm not all the way left. I have engineering friends. But what you need to do as a leader and a leadership team is kind of hit that sweet spot of shippable. So you want to, keep your bar high from a design perspective of, is this good enough to go out the door? Are we going to be proud of it? But at the same time, there's diminishing returns as you get further to the right. And so the only way to know what those returns are is to know the business really well. So that becomes really critical at this phase. So the team at this phase, they're doing all the things from the previous phases, but they're also doing kind of two interrelated other things. And that is like proactive product development. They're going out, they're finding things that users are saying through research, exploratory research, through feedback, and they are going out and finding ways to improve the product rather than just having that handed down to them. And the second are these North Star initiatives. So, sometimes this is done in a separate group. I've found that it works best when, everyone in the design team and the product team is really invested in being part of setting the vision for the product. But figuring out, like, what does this look like 3 to 5 years down the road? How do we craft a scenario that explains how we would like users to interact with not just our product, but our company? And then using that and the skills that we got from the previous stage of being able to break those bigger projects down into smaller pieces to really set what that roadmap looks like for the longer term. So at Salesforce, I have a colleague who was able to carve out a healthy chunk of time for her team to work on a North Star initiative to really define what the sales product that we developed, what the vision was for that. And they took 6 months to kind of go out, really talk to users in depth, get a lot of data, and craft that North Star vision for what the product would look like. And it wasn't screens, it was just scenarios of like, here's how we could best integrate in that person's day. And then that was broken down into pieces that are now informing vast majority of that team's kind of 2-year roadmap. So it definitely can be done. It's something that takes a huge investment of time, but at this stage, you should be able to kind of carve out that time for your teams. And just overall, what you're trying to accomplish in this phase is, work with your colleagues to make sure that design is a huge part of the company overall, and it doesn't just live in the design team. Everyone should feel ownership over making a great user experience. So I have one last tip for the road now that we've kind of like reached the end of that journey, and that is definitely have fun doing this. We work in a really fun industry. So if you're not doing this journey with people that you like working with and enjoy hanging out with, you are either doing it wrong or doing it with the wrong people. So I hope that's not the case, but you should always have fun. It's awesome stuff. I've really enjoyed my experience as a designer and a design leader, and so I hope you all do too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan.